Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Generalist, the show where we just talk about things to talk about things. If you're new here, thank you for coming, thank you for visiting, and as I said earlier on, we just talk about all things general knowledge, and the topic could vary from week to week, but I promised the viewers a specific episode today, and so we will be talking about that. You might go to previous videos and see that my delivery varies wildly from episode to episode. Give me that indulgence as a brand new YouTube character. I'm still trying to find my voice, so bear with me. And this episode might be contentious. You know, there's a lot of things that many of you might not agree with, many of you might see differently, and you're welcome to talk about that in the comments. And I'm happy to have a discussion with you there. So please, comment, please speak, and looking forward to seeing you in the comments. Without further ado, we're going to talk about this very contentious topic, and it is South Africa. Is South Africa a failed state, effectively? We see, if you are South African, that is, you would see that there are many, things that people say about the country. Many of the headlines talk about, you get the impression that we are looking at a country that's teetering on the brink of total collapse. In fact, many people will say that it is a failed state already, that it is done for, doomed, put in the same category as the likes of, Somalia and Syria, and that isn't to say that those countries are doomed and done for. Anybody from Syria and Somalia, there's still hope for you yet. People do speak about South Africa as, a failed state, a state that is, that is not functional, that has serious problems, serious issues, and I don't think anybody can deny that. And that many people would quote, the unemployment statistics, which are abnormally high at 32.9% at the time of speaking. A Gini coefficient, for those of you who don't know what a Gini coefficient is, it's basically a metric or an index that's used to determine inequality in any given state. It's calculated on a coefficient of 0 to 1, with 0 being totally equal and 1 being totally unequal. South Africa, if you didn't know, has the highest Gini coefficient at 0.63. Not good, right? But the purpose of this video is to really disseminate, or to go into, the allegations, and to see if there's any to determine the veracity of those claims, and if indeed, South Africa is a failed state or anything close to it, as many of the media reports or many YouTube channels you might be watching have said in the past. So, without further ado, let's begin. In order for us to determine whether South Africa is a failed state or not, it's important for us to see what a failed state is. I've decided to go with the Fragile State Index. For those of you who don't know, the Fragile State Index is an index that basically looks at a variety of factors to determine a state's vulnerability to conflicts or collapse. And again, it's ranked on a scale, and 172 countries are considered for the purposes of that index. And the reason why I've settled on the Fragile States Index, I think the criteria gives us a good picture of whether a state is, failed or on the brink of failure or not. So the index looks at a state's ability to exert control over its physical borders or the loss of its territory thereof, the erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, an inability to provide reasonable public services, the inability of said state to interact with other states as a member of the international community. Simple, effective, and comprehensive enough to get an idea of whether a state is teetering or already in the realm of failed statehood. So now that we have the criteria set, let's take a look and see how South Africa fares when judged on that set of parameters. So the first metric, has the South African government lost territory or the ability to, or its monopoly on the legitimate use of military force in its territorial borders? Well, that's an easy answer. That's an easy no. And you'll find that South African borders have remained the same since Namibia's independence in 1990. So I think that's a simple and easy no. The next question is, has the South African government lost the legitimate authority to make collective decisions? Again, as much as the media will tried to tell you otherwise, that's also a no. That can be proven in the fact that laws are regularly promulgated and passed within Parliament and are enforced accordingly once they have been promulgated or passed as, laws with force and effect. And now we get to the interesting ones. Has the South African government lost its ability to provide reasonable public services? And this one is a very loaded question. However, we'll stick to a few basic services. These include basic education, which we will judge by literacy rates, the provision of electricity, because oftentimes this is something that's quoted widely as a reason for failure. Crime, another category that's often contested. Inequality and unemployment, which are also categories that are often discussed in the media. We'll start with the easy one, literacy rates. This one, while you might have read numerous reports about South African children being unable to read and write at a certain level, when you look deeper, you'll find that adult literacy rates have largely remained the same over the last few decades, hovering at about the 90% mark, a figure which is quite high for a developing nation. So if literacy rates are pretty decent for a developing nation, what about electricity? We've been told about rolling blackouts, aka load shedding for the South Africans watching. And I don't think any of us can dispute the fact that it has been an issue that does, admittedly, cost the economy billions and billions of rands every single year. In fact, various studies say that since it was introduced in 2007, load shedding or rolling blackouts cost the economy about 1.8% to 5.1% of GDP year on year, depending on which study you would be looking at. And as I said earlier, it's not something that we can dispute credibly. Again, it's an incomplete story because while South Africa is hampered by rolling blackouts, aka load shedding, we can just as well look at the other side, which is what people often skirt over, is the fact that South Africa is a main contributor in the Southern African Power Pool. For those of you who don't know what the SAPP is, it's basically the SADC region's agreement. It's basically an agreement between multiple countries within SADC to share power across the region. And as its main contributor, South Africa actually provides power, reliably so, to 7 of its neighbors, including Mozambique, Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini. The exact volume varies from year to year, but generally, Mozambique is the largest beneficiary of South Africa's power. So again, a complex issue that requires complexity to look at. Now we move on to another contentious topic, crime. So crime statistics. According to the Crime Index, South Africa ranks as the 5th most violent nation in the world, with a coefficient of about 74.6. But before we dive into crime statistics, I think I have to point out my own biases. That would be the fact that I tend to lean towards the side of optimism, and that will be reflected in what I think of crime statistics and how they're collected. And again, I really encourage you to post your comments and post any areas where you feel I might not have given it the proper care or attention. When you look at the crime statistics, you would see that South Africa is ostensibly more violent than places like Syria, the DRC, Somalia, Yemen, and Ecuador. Many countries which you could safely conclude are failed states. Or even if you don't see them as failed states, states that you can safely conclude are failed states or states that are currently blighted by ongoing armed conflicts. And you can see where I'm going here. We have to interrogate how these statistics are derived, the intention of the people taking those statistics, and whether we can rely on them at all, given the circumstances in which those data points are collected. I think if we were all to put on our thinking caps and really scrutinize the numbers, I think we would all come to the conclusion that we can't really rely on the data of countries where we know certain state functions are either non-existent or really weak. And so can you really rely on that index? Just food for thought. And again, that isn't to say that crime and violent crime specifically in this country isn't a problem. I think, and you will see in future episodes, that I'm a big proponent of looking at everything holistically and entirely. Context does matter after all. And in this context, I think it would be important to adjust the weight that we put to an index that takes numbers at face value. Inequality is another metric we can look at. I think we've all come across the image of a neighborhood in Cape Town in which one part is like a predominantly white suburb that has like houses with pools and spacious yards that borders, I would assume, somewhere in the Cape Flats, where all the structures are poorly built, seemingly shoddy, and bunched close together. I think we can all agree that whether you are an optimist or not, that inequality, especially along racial lines, is something that the South African government has failed to adequately address since the African National Congress had become the ruling party in 1994. When we speak about equality, we have to mention the other elephant in the room, that is unemployment. According to Stats SA, South Africa's unemployment rate stands at about 32.9% at the time of speaking, a number that Stats SA says doesn't include people of working age that have actively given up on the job-seeking process. And once you account for people who are of working age and who are able to work, who have given up on seeking employment altogether, that number goes up to about 41.3%. Again, a number that seems scary on the face of it. But let's interrogate it. And the reason why it does, partly because the methods that are used by Stats SA to determine or derive this number are hotly debated. For example, in April, the CEO of Capitec Bank, one of South Africa's major banks, disputes this figure. His basis being that Stats SA doesn't do a good job of accounting for the informal sector as a means to employ people. For those of you who don't know, the informal sector can be something like selling fruit on the side of the street, doing somebody's nails in your home, maybe operating a lift club or school transport for children, things that don't necessarily show up in an official employment contract with a formal employee-employer relationship. And according to Mr. Harry Fourie, who is Capitec CEO, he says that once you account for the informal sector, the number would actually be much closer to 10% rather than 32%, citing other developing countries like Mexico and India's informal employment sector statistics as his basis for this. Of course, Stats SA disputed this, claiming that 19.5% of their employment statistics account for this number. But even they say in the fine print that their models and data points could be improved. In my personal opinion, I am inclined to agree with Mr. Fourie. Not necessarily in that it's closer to 10%, but when you look at the numbers, you'll find that South Africa's informal employment sector is somewhere around the 30% mark, a number which, compared to other developing countries, is a statistical outlier in that it's abnormally lower. Like, for example, if you look at Mexico, that number goes up to 54%. Rwanda, which is lauded for having an unemployment statistic of about 1.6%, cites a figure of well over 80% in the informal sector. And in India, the trend continues, with the vast majority of Indian citizens being counted as informally employed. When you also look at the fact that, and there are 2 points of conflict between the two factions. For example, so when you look at these 2 points of conflict, on the one hand, Capitec Bank, according to statistics, services about 30% of South Africa's population. And because of their market position, that is, the fact that most of their clients do come from working class backgrounds, many of whom are township based, you could make a case that their data would be a fair representation of what might actually be the truth on the ground. On the other hand, Stats SA, or the South African government as a whole, doesn't really have much of an incentive to overstate an unemployment claim, given the fact that a high unemployment rate is not in their interest, as it would be a damning indictment on their ability to provide for its citizens. However, you can't ignore the outlying statistic, the abnormally low informal sector participation statistic, and that would suggest, in my opinion, again, and you're free to tell me otherwise or show me otherwise, everybody has a right to an opinion, right? That the definition that Stats SA uses to define unemployment is perhaps quite narrow. And again, I must qualify this by saying that doesn't mean South Africa doesn't have an employment problem, or that it adequately addresses the issue of giving people meaningful work with which they can support themselves and their families. But we need to separate issues. And I do think that unemployment in itself and the quality of employment are two separate issues that should be addressed separately. And if we then look at it holistically, we can say that two things can be true. One, that the unemployment statistic is probably not correct, and it's somewhere in between 10% and 30%, and significantly lower than the official figure of 32.9 and 41.3% respectively. But at the same time, the quality of employment, something Capitec Bank themselves would admit, is probably not where it should be. And again, a policy failure by South Africa's government. But again, those are separate issues. And then the last category would be a state's ability to be a meaningful member of the international community. And you would see with South Africa's recent effort to support the Palestinian court by taking Israel to the ICJ, South Africa's role in mediating and peacekeeping efforts, which are well documented throughout the African continent, South Africa's participation in blocs like BRICS and SADC. And once you look at all of those together, I think it's pretty clear that South Africa is a very active member of the international community. So that is not in dispute. And once we look at all those things together, I think you will find that while it is true that South Africa has serious issues to grapple with, you'll find that the designation of South Africa as a failed state is premature, because for every negative stat, there is a positive stat as well. For those of you who don't know, that while South Africa is the 24th largest country, it actually has the 12th largest road network in the world. There's a functional airport in every South African major city. South Africa has the highest Human Development Index at 0.74 in sub-Saharan Africa. And when you account for North African countries, it's the 6th highest. And going back to our index, the Fragile State Index, you'll find that South Africa ranks 80th out of 172 countries. Not anywhere near the top, obviously, but far from the bottom, and better than regional superpowers like Brazil, for example. And if South Africa is less fragile than a country like Brazil, I think you could say that the designation as a failed state is quite premature. We might differ on where we are on the sliding scale. I don't think anybody can dispute that. And again, I think it's important for me to make the distinction that just because a country isn't a failed state, it doesn't mean that a country is without flaws and that there aren't any serious challenges that a country would need to face to avoid sliding into the realm of failure. I really intended this episode to be an exercise in looking at things holistically, contextualizing, and also just telling the story that two things can be true at the same time. Because I think we live in a world that's increasingly polarized, that increasingly looks at topics, looks at issues, deals with issues with hyperbole, and a media environment that we must mention has an incentive to peddle negative news. But not only that, in the face of social media, which can get news to you much quicker than a news channel can or a newspaper can, we see that media outlets have increasingly moved to polarizing and biased news that looks to appeal to certain people's fears or worst case scenarios. So, if you take anything from this episode, you should take care to scrutinize all media sources that you consume, and take care to ensure that you are aware of the biases and the focus group that media outlet seeks to engage with or appease. And on that cheerful note, that's the end of today's episode. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to argue with me in the comments. I'll check them regularly. Regardless, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.